Hello, this is Charlie Hieneman, professor of philosophy at Utah State University, and today I want to tell you a story about a letter that this guy wrote to this guy in 1665. It's a story that I call a story of the worm and the blood. Let me set the context. In 1665, England and the Netherlands were at war with one another. Basically, they were fighting over who had the better navy, since that would determine who would get to run the colonies in Asia and the Americas. In June of 1665, they fought the Battle of Lowestoft, just off the English coast, and it was a tremendous battle. You can imagine the thick clouds of gunpowder, cannonballs smashing into wooden hulls, sending sprays of deadly splinters in all directions. As if being at war wasn't bad enough, plague was hitting both Amsterdam and London in 1665. Now, this was to be the last time the Black Death visited Europe, let's hope. Other speakers in this series have already talked about the horror of the plague, but I want to mention the effect that it had on people's rationality. Daniel Defoe, in his Journal of the Plague Years, recounts how people in their desperation ran toward quacks and witches for cures and then were thoroughly fleeced. Mobs of people convinced themselves they saw angels, and a number of people went stark raving mad simply out of their fear and their distress. In the middle of all this, these two guys wrote letters to each other. Benedictus de Spinoza was a renegade Jew in Amsterdam, a young man embarking upon a career of extremely independent thinking. And he was exchanging letters with Henry Oldenburg, an expatriate German living in London and serving as the secretary for the Royal Society, which was a gentleman's club, no, not that kind of gentleman's club, a club of gents in the leisure class who were interested in how nature works. The two wrote to one another about all kinds of things, from lenses and comets to prospects of war with Sweden and France. But in the summer of 1665, what must have been foremost on their minds was war and plague. Those things do tend to be distracting. In one letter, Spinoza wrote to Oldenburg that he tried to understand the craziness of human beings in a larger context of great natural forces, even though he didn't understand how each part of nature agrees with the whole to which it belongs, and how it coheres with the other parts. So even when things seemed to him vain, disordered, and absurd, he tried to simply live and let live. But in the same letter, Spinoza tells the story of a little worm living in somebody's blood. That little worm wouldn't know what's going on. It would think that the other little bodies in the blood, like platelets and whatnot, were just bouncing off one another to no purpose. It wouldn't know it was living inside some huge organism that had certain metabolic requirements that sent the parts of the blood this way and that those bodies were compelled to adapt themselves to one another as the universal nature of the blood requires, so that they agree with one another in a definite way. The lesson that Spinoza meant Oldenburg to draw from this lovely little story is obvious. Even when life seems absurd, there are explanations for what is going on. You may not like them, but they're there nonetheless. So don't give yourself up to thinking in terms of magic and superstition. Try to be reasonable with yourself, with your circumstance, and with other people. And you'll all get through this one way or another. So what ended up happening to these guys? A couple of years later, Oldenburg was sent to the Tower of London under the suspicion of being a spy. After all, he did write a lot of letters to foreigners. He was released in a couple of months, duly chastened and ever more cautious in his dealings, and he continued to serve the Royal Society until some unknown disease took him out in 1677. Spinoza went on to publish his theological political treatise, a work which was so radical in its conclusions about religion and the Bible that one reader called it a book forged in hell. But he didn't have to face the wrath of angry mobs, as some little beastie in his blood, one we now call Mycobacterium tuberculosis, killed him in 1677. You never know what will take you out, but until that day comes, be reasonable and try to understand what's going on.